Oregon Territory, July 1872. The sun was just cresting over the Blue Mountains when Naomi Whitlow stepped between her father and the open barn doors, fists clenched at her sides. Her lip was still split from yesterday. She did not cry anymore, not since her mother died 3 years ago. "Get out of my way, girl," her father growled, voice thick from the whiskey he drank before breakfast. "I fed the horses already," Naomi said quietly. "You do not need to go in there." He gave her a hard stare, then his jaw tightened and his hand curled into a fist. "But before it could rise, not while I'm breathing." The voice came from behind the corral, low and firm like thunder before a storm. Naomi's eyes widened. Her father froze. A tall figure stepped through the morning light. He wore trail-dusted denim, a tan duster coat, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had handled trouble before and never once backed down. "Who the hell are you?" her father barked. The man did not flinch. He stopped just a few feet away, boots planted steady in the dirt. "Name's Vaughn Fletcher," he said. "I was hired to help with the cattle drive." He turned his face toward Naomi. His eyes were steady, warm, "But I do not stand by when a man raises a fist to a woman." Naomi's throat tightened. She had never seen anyone stop her father before. Her father's face turned red. "You think you're some kind of hero? I think you've had enough for one morning," Vaughn said. "Why do you not head back inside before things get worse?" There was a long pause. Something passed between the two men, something sharp and tense. Then her father spat in the dirt and stalked off toward the house, muttering curses under his breath. Naomi did not move. Vaughn looked at her again, and this time his voice softened. "You all right?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking. "You sure?" "Yes," she whispered. He tipped his hat. "If you ever need me to stand in again, just say the word." She looked away, embarrassed by the heat rising in her cheeks. "Thank you." Vaughn turned and headed toward the barn, giving her space, but he glanced back once, just long enough to make sure she was still standing. By late afternoon, the sun beat down hard. Vaughn worked the cattle with the other hired hands, sweat darkening his shirt. Naomi stayed by the well, hauling water, scraping mud from the troughs, and trying to disappear into the routine. But she kept watching him from the corner of her eye. He was not like the other cowboys her father hired. Those men barely spoke to her except to leer or mutter. Vaughn was quiet. Focused, he treated the horses with care. He laughed once with the cook, a deep, honest sound that startled her. That night she found him sitting alone by the fire behind the bunkhouse, rolling tobacco. "You always travel alone?" she asked. He looked up. "Most of the time." She sat on the edge of a log across from him. "Where are you from?" "Texas, near San Saba originally, long gone from there now," she nodded. "Family? Gone." He paused. "Yours?" "Just my father. My mother passed. I was 16. His eyes met hers across the firelight. "That must have been hard," she shrugged. "I manage." "I saw how you stood today," he said. "You do more than manage." Her throat tightened again. She looked down at her hands. "He was not always like this. He used to be kind. After Mama died, it just shifted." Vaughn said nothing for a long moment. "I know what it is to lose someone," he said quietly. "It changes a man, but it does not give him the right to turn cruel." Naomi looked at him. "Why did you step in?" He held her gaze. "Because you deserved better." Something passed between them, then quiet and real. She felt it settle deep in her chest. The next morning, her father was gone before dawn. No note, no explanation, just his rifle missing and his mare gone from the stables. Naomi stood at the kitchen door, arms crossed, staring toward the road. Vaughn joined her. "He leave often?" "Sometimes," she said. "Usually when he runs out of whiskey or loses too much at cards in Pendleton. You think he'll be back?" She did not answer. He gave her a long look. "You want me to stay?" Her eyes met his. "You would." "I gave my word," Vaughn said. "Besides, someone needs to patch that fence before the cattle wander off." She smiled then, just a little. "All right." He nodded, tipping his hat. Days passed. The work was steady and hard, but Vaughn stayed. Naomi found herself laughing more. She showed him how her mother had taught her to bake cornbread in the iron stove. He taught her how to ride bareback without falling off, though she did twice, and he caught her both times. One afternoon, they sat on the porch, boots up on the rail, watching the sky turn orange. "Do you ever stop moving?" she asked. He looked sideways at her. "Sometimes I think about it," and he shrugged. "Never had a reason to." She turned her face toward him. And now he met her eyes. "Might have one," her breath caught. She looked down at her hands. "I do not know much about what comes next." "I do," he said. "It starts with trust and time. And what if I do not know how to do either?" "Then we start slow," he said. "But I am not going anywhere unless you ask me to." She looked at him. Really looked. The way his jaw tensed when he was worried, the way he always stood between her and harm, the way he had never once looked at her like she was a burden. And for the first time in a long time, something inside her felt safe. She nodded. "All right." He smiled, then small, real, and she knew this was the beginning. The heat broke 2 nights later with a stretch of wind that came down from the north, lifting the dust and rattling the barn slats. Naomi stood behind the smokehouse, apron damp with brine, watching the trees shiver against the twilight. Vaughn was mending the back gate, hammer slow and even, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. "You ever stay through a winter up here?" she asked, voice low so it would not carry. He didn't look over. "Not yet. You'd need a heavier coat." He glanced at her then, one brow raised. "That an invitation?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she peeled her gloves off and set them on the beam beside her. "I'm just thinking aloud." He set the hammer down, came to lean against the post near her. "That's the kind of thinking I could get used to." The breeze tugged at her hair, lifting strands from her braid. She didn't move to fix them. "I don't know what it would look like," she said. "You staying." "There's no set plan." "I'm not asking for a plan," he said. "Just the chance to build something." She met his gaze. "I've never had much that held. I'm not going anywhere unless you want me gone." She blinked hard, then turned her face toward the trees. "The last person who said that to me was my mother." His voice softened. "She sounds like she was a good one." "She was," Naomi said. "She could make molasses out of nearly anything, and she always knew when a storm was coming, even before the clouds did." Vaughn nodded. "My sister used to say the same about our grandmother, said her bones could feel the weather better than any barometer." Naomi smiled faintly. "She's still alive." "No, fever took her. Took my sister too. That's when I left Texas." She looked back at him then, quiet and steady. "You running from it?" "No," he said. "Just carrying it different now." The wind picked up. She stepped closer, not quite touching him. "You ever get tired of carrying it alone?" He didn't speak right away. "Then, every damn day." She nodded once, then reached for his hand. Her fingers slid into his rough palm without hesitation, like they'd done it 100 times. He curled his fingers around hers, slow and sure. They stood that way until the wind died down. The next morning, Naomi found the ledger tucked behind the flour sack her father's, thick with names and numbers she didn't recognize. She brought it out to the porch where Vaughn was tightening a saddle girth. "Look at this," she said, flipping it open. "He's been borrowing against the land." Vaughn took it, scanned the pages. 2 notes from the Mercantile in La Grande and this one D. "Hurst Pendleton, that's a gambler, means he owes money, more than he can pay. If Hurst comes looking, it won't be with patience." Naomi crossed her arms. "The land's in my mother's name. He never changed the deed." "That could buy you leverage," Vaughn said, "if you can find the papers. They're in the loft." She didn't hesitate. "Come on." They climbed up the ladder together, dust rising around them. Naomi pulled a tin box from beneath a broken rocking chair. Inside, folded careful, the deed bore her mother's name, Miriam Whitlow, ink faded but legible. "Will this hold?" she asked. "It's enough to keep anyone from claiming what's yours," Vaughn said. "But only if you're willing to stand on it." She looked at him. "I am now." That night, Vaughn dragged a cot from the bunkhouse into the barn loft. "You ever sleep under the stars from 2 stories up?" he asked. She laughed, pulling a blanket over her shoulder. "Not yet." He lay beside her, boots off, hands behind his head. They didn't touch, but she could feel the warmth of him nearby. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Riding out, never staying long?" "Sometimes," he said. "But lately, I've been thinking about what it'd feel like to stay." She turned her head toward him. "Why now?" "Because I finally found something worth staying for." She didn't speak, but she reached for his hand again. This time, she laced their fingers tight. A coyote howled somewhere beyond the hills, and the stars above them blinked steady and bright. Neither of them moved. There was no need to. The first sign of trouble came with the black gelding galloping hard up the slope, reins loose and no rider. Naomi spotted it from the orchard, her hands sticky with apricot resin, and dropped the pail without thinking. Vaughn had just come back from the ridge with a sack of flour over his shoulder and met her halfway up the path. "That horse belongs to Silas Boone," she said, breath uneven from the run. "He was with my father last spring in Pendleton." Vaughn didn't ask questions. He turned back to the barn, grabbed his rifle from the wall peg, and saddled his own mount in silence. Naomi handed him the holster she kept under the grain bin, the one he hadn't touched since the morning he arrived. "Boone's not one to travel alone," she said. "If his horse came back bleeding and empty, he tugged the strap tight. I'll ride to the bluff trail. If I'm not back by dusk, stay inside, keep the doors barred." She nodded, but her stomach was tight as rawhide. Vaughn paused at the barn mouth, his hand brushing her elbow. "I'll come back," he said. "You'd better." He rode east, the dust rising behind him in a long, thin line. Naomi spent the day checking the latches, drawing water, and keeping the rifle beside her as she moved between chores. The house was too quiet without Vaughn's boots on the floorboards or his low voice humming some tune she didn't know the words to. She made supper out of beans and salt pork, but didn't light the stove. Dusk came like a closing hand. The sun sank behind the hills, casting long shadows across the pasture. Naomi stood at the porch rail watching the tree line. An hour after dark, she heard the slow clop of hooves, not rushed. Deliberate, she stepped onto the packed earth, rifle raised. "It's me," Vaughn called. She didn't lower the gun until she saw his face in the lantern light. His coat was torn at the shoulder, and there was a thin line of blood running down his wrist, but he was upright. Behind him, another horse followed, dragging a bundled shape tied across the saddle. Her chest went cold. "Is that your father?" Vaughn said. "He's alive." She helped him bring the body down. Her father groaned and cursed weakly, breath sour with rot-gut spirits. There was a bruise across his jaw and a cut above his eye. "Found him outside Hurst's camp," Vaughn said. They'd stripped him of his gun and left him with a bottle and a boot to the ribs. He was trying to walk home. Naomi stared at her father, who blinked up at her like a man staring into firelight from the bottom of a well. "I didn't ask for help," he rasped. "You never do," she said. They dragged him to the spare cot in the root cellar, where the air was cool and the damp walls muffled sound. Naomi dressed the wound without speaking. Vaughn lit a lantern and stood by the door. "You want him to stay?" he asked, voice even. She wiped her hands on a rag. "He'll stay until he can walk again, then he goes." Vaughn nodded once. "You're not him, Naomi." "I know." Later they sat on the porch, neither saying much until the moon was high overhead. "He used to carry me on his shoulders," she said finally. "Used to sing when he worked the forge. My mother would laugh and say he had no ear for pitch." Vaughn looked out across the pasture. "Sometimes grief's like a snake under the porch. You don't see it until it bites someone you thought you knew." She leaned against the post, head tilted back. "I don't want to hate him. But I don't want to carry him either." "You don't have to," Vaughn said. "You're not alone anymore." She turned her face toward him. "We really building something here?" "We already are." He reached for her hand, calloused fingers brushing hers. She didn't hesitate this time. "You planning on asking properly?" she asked. He smiled, quiet and unhurried. "Come first frost, I'll take you down to the preacher in Union, if you'll have me." "I'll have you now," she said. He kissed her then, slow and sure, the kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything except to be returned. And it was. The wind stirred the dry grass below, and somewhere a barn owl called long into the night. Inside, her father slept alone in the dark. Outside, Naomi stood with Vaughn beneath a sky that stretched wide and open enough for anything new to begin. The first frost came early that year, silvering fence rails and curling the last of the pumpkin vines into brittle loops. The smokehouse took on the scent of cured meat and dry cedar. Naomi stood by the back window one morning, watching a raven pick at the frozen ground beneath the orchard trees. Vaughn was outside splitting kindling, the axe rising and falling with quiet rhythm. She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You always this calm before big things?" she asked through the open pane. He didn't look up. "Only when I'm certain." "What makes you so sure?" He lifted another log, set it on the block, and split it clean down the middle. "Not a thing about this feels unsure." She smiled without thinking, then turned from the window and stepped outside. The cold bit through her boots, but she didn't mind. She crossed the yard and leaned against the fence post beside him. "I found my mother's locket this morning," she said. "It was tucked behind the clock on the mantel, still got her picture in it. Faded, but yes." She was 17 when it was taken, hair tied back with blue ribbon. I'd forgotten how gentle her mouth looked when she wasn't trying to hold everything together. Vaughn set the axe aside. "You planning to wear it?" She nodded. "I think she'd like that." She always said it was meant for when something true came along. He glanced at her hands. "You want a band?" "No," she said, "not for show, just the vows." He reached for her hand, and this time, instead of taking it, he pressed something into her palm, a silver button dulled with age. "That was my mother's," he said. "Off the dress she wore the day she married my father. It's the only piece I've got left from her." Naomi turned the button over between her fingers. "You sure you want to part with it?" "I'm not parting with it," he said. "I'm giving it to you." They didn't speak again for a long while. The cold settled between trees, and the wind carried the scent of pine and distant snow. That night, Naomi boiled coffee over the hearth while Vaughn stitched a tear in the shoulder of his good shirt. Her father hadn't stirred in 2 days, his breathing shallow and uneven from the fever that had taken hold. She'd sent word with Jonah Lee, the trapper who passed through once a month, to bring the doctor up from Union if the man could be spared. "You think he'll make it?" she asked without turning. "I don't know," Vaughn said, "but I saw him try to stand yesterday. That means he's not done fighting yet." "I don't want him at the wedding," she said. Vaughn didn't argue. "Then he won't be." She poured coffee into 2 tin mugs and handed him one. "You ever think about children?" He took the mug, nodded once. "I've thought about what kind of man I'd need to be first." Naomi lowered herself to the floor, knees tucked up beneath her skirt. "And I want to be steady." He looked over. "Not perfect, just steady. The kind of man who stays when it's hard, not just when it's good." She held his gaze. "I'd like that kind of father for mine and for theirs." He reached out, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Then that's who I'll be." They sat close, wrapped in wool and firelight. Outside, the frost deepened, turning the world sharp and still. 3 days later, the preacher arrived, his boots caked in trail mud, his coat too thin for the cold. Naomi wore her mother's shawl and the locket, the silver button stitched just below the collar. Vaughn's shirt was patched but clean. They stood beside the well, with the orchard behind them and the hills rising quiet in the distance. The preacher's voice was low and certain. Naomi's hands didn't shake when she placed them in Vaughn's. His thumb touched her wrist just once, enough to steady the beat beneath her skin. When the vows were done and the blessing spoken, Naomi turned toward the house. She didn't look back. The wind carried no scent of whiskey, no footsteps followed her. Inside, she set 2 plates on the table. The stew was warm, the bread still soft from the hearth. Vaughn stepped in, dusting snow from his hat. "You sure about this?" he asked, voice quieter than it had been outside. She looked up. "I was sure the moment you stayed." He crossed the room, leaned down, and kissed her forehead. "Then let's build it," and they did. Each morning began with work and ended with rest. Some days were harder than others, but none were empty. Naomi planted winter kale beneath canvas sheets. Vaughn repaired the front porch rail and built a cradle from pine. The doctor came and went. Her father regained enough strength to drink broth, then walk 10 paces on his own. He didn't speak much, and when he did, it was only to ask for water or light. One afternoon, Naomi stood at the window, watching Vaughn lead their 2 milk cows down toward the creek pasture. She rested a hand over her stomach and felt the slow, certain rhythm beneath. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. This was the life they'd made, quiet, solid, and entirely their own. Naomi didn't notice the wagon until it was nearly at the gate. The wheels creaked dry over the frozen earth, and a pair of oxen pulled it slow under the gray sky. She stepped from the porch, wiping her hands on her skirts, heart already braced. Vaughn came from the shed, sleeves rolled, a fresh pine beam over one shoulder. The driver was a narrow man in a wool coat patched at the elbows. He lifted a hand, not in greeting but obligation. "You Naomi Fletcher?" he asked, voice flat as winter light. She nodded once. "Got a parcel from Mr. D. Hurst of Pendleton. Says it's a final claim." Vaughn came to stand beside her. "We don't owe Hurst a thing." The man shrugged and climbed down. "Ain't my quarrel. I was paid to deliver, not argue." He unlatched the rear of the wagon and pulled down a wooden trunk heavy enough to groan against the boards. Naomi stepped closer and saw the initials SW carved into the side. Her father's work. She opened it slowly. Inside were ledgers, a roll of land scrip, and a folded paper sealed in wax. She broke the seal and scanned the lines, lips tight. "What is it?" Vaughn asked. "He signed over the last of the debt," she said. "Before he took ill, in exchange, Hurst waived claim to the land." Vaughn's brow furrowed. "Why would he do that?" She reached into the trunk and pulled out a smaller envelope addressed in her father's hand. She didn't open it. The driver tipped his hat. "That's all of it. Good luck to you." They stood in silence until the wagon disappeared down the trail. She opened the envelope by the hearth that night. The fire had settled low and Vaughn sat nearby, carving notches into the cradle's frame. The letter was brief. No apologies, only a line asking her to remember the man he had been, not the one he became. Beneath it, a deed bearing her mother's name, now amended to include Naomi's. "He knew the end was coming," she said. Vaughn didn't look up. "He did what he could. Might not make it right, but it's something." She folded the paper and tucked it into the drawer beside the ledger. "He's gone now. The fever broke last night. He didn't wake." Vaughn set the chisel down. "You want me to build a box?" She nodded. "Cedar. He always said pine rotted too fast." They buried him just past the orchard, where the ground rose gently toward the hills. Naomi placed one smooth stone at the head and tied a scrap of her mother's quilt around it. Later that day, she held the last of the land scrip over the fire and let it burn, the edges curling black, the ash lifting like dust. "I don't want any part of that man's dealings left in this house," she said. Vaughn crossed the room and placed a hand at her back. "It's your land now. It's ours," she said, "and I want to keep it that way." They spent the rest of the week clearing the far pasture. Snow clung to the fence lines, but the sun had begun its slow climb back toward strength. Naomi kept her hands busy shaping seed lists, marking the calendar for spring planting and stitching a lining onto the cradle mattress. One morning, she caught Vaughn standing beside the orchard, staring toward the hill. She came up beside him, brushing ice from her mittens. "What is it?" He held up a length of twine, already knotted. "Thinking we could string a swing between those two apple trees." "For the baby, for you," he said. "For now," she laughed, breath clouding the air. "You planning to carry me up into it, if I have to?" She narrowed her eyes. "You're not as spry as you think," he grinned. "Care to test that theory?" She stepped back, boots crunching hard into the snow. "I'll test it when the ground's not frozen solid." That night, they sat by the fire, her head resting against his chest, his fingers tracing circles over the back of her hand. No words passed between them, but none were needed. By April, the ground thawed enough to break open. Naomi planted carrots and early peas, her belly rounding beneath her apron. Vaughn built a second chicken coop and cleared the north trail of fallen branches. They slept close each night, the window cracked to let in the scent of pine and damp earth. When the baby came, it was near midnight, with the wind howling low through the eaves. Naomi bore down with quiet strength, her teeth clenched, one hand gripping the edge of the quilt Vaughn's mother's button had been sewn into. He stayed at her side, holding the cloth to her brow, whispering steadiness into her ear. The child was a girl, dark-haired and wide-eyed, lungs strong and full of fight. They named her Miriam Ruth, and she took to Naomi's arms as if they'd never been separate. Vaughn held her next, his thumb brushing gently over the downy curve of her head. "She's got your mouth," he said. Naomi smiled weakly. "Poor thing." "Not at all. That mouth told me to stay. That mouth built this home. Built it with you," she said. "We did this together." They raised her with the same quiet strength that had carried them both. Summers brought rows of tomatoes and the low hum of bees in the orchard. Winters pressed them close, but never bitter. Miriam took her first steps on the porch, fell into Vaughn's arms, and laughed like her heart already knew it was safe when Naomi stood at the edge of the pasture one afternoon, watching Vaughn teach their daughter how to hold a halter. The wind caught her braid and lifted it over her shoulder. She closed her eyes, breathed deep, and felt the earth solid beneath her boots. The past no longer haunted the cracks of the house or the corners of her mind. It had been buried properly, honored, and let go. What remained was hers and Vaughn's, and the child they had brought into the world with love and labor and the fierce will to stay. She stepped down the path toward them, the sun warm on her back, and called out her daughter's name. Vaughn looked up, eyes steady and full of light. Home was not just the land or the house. It was this: a man who never looked away, a child who reached for her hand, and the quiet knowing that she would never again have to face a storm alone.